for a long time was just fun. And it was just a blast. You know, we just had a lot of good times. When he married Robyn, that's where I was like, oh.
What if everything you thought you knew about sister wives, about Cody, the marriages, the family, wasn't the full story? Not a scandal, not a tabloid headline, just the kind of truth that only becomes visible after years of watching people slowly unravel under the weight of their own choices. This isn't just a series about polygamy. It's a window into how people break down under the expectations of roles they never truly agreed to play, and how one man's charisma slowly transformed into control masked as leadership. The breakdown didn't happen overnight. It crept in through small silences, through eyes that no longer sparkled during family dinners, through kids learning to fend for themselves while their father pursued another love story on a different schedule. It wasn't the dramatic divorce that cracked the foundation. It was the subtle erosion of trust, of mutual respect, of shared effort. The children grew up in households divided by geography and favoritism, witnessing their mothers exchange tight-lipped glances instead of honest words, all while Cody explained away his inconsistencies as mere misunderstandings. From the beginning, Kody Brown positioned himself as the center of this spiritual universe, a man on a mission, leading his family with what he claimed was divine purpose. He carried the confidence of someone who believed in his own mythology, always speaking with the authority of someone who was convinced God had whispered directly into his ear. But when the mythology was tested by the realities of parenting, emotional labor, and fairness, cracks emerged. And those cracks weren't filled with repentance or humility. They were patched over with excuses. Cody was never at fault, not according to him. It was always someone else's lack of effort, someone else's unwillingness to sacrifice more. He repeatedly framed the women's concerns as attacks, their emotional needs as evidence of disloyalty. He painted himself as misunderstood, as the burdened leader carrying the weight of everyone's dissatisfaction on his shoulders. But those shoulders weren't carrying much of anything at home. Cody began to show up only where he wanted to be, and predictably, that place was wherever Robyn was. The other wives became satellites orbiting a sun that gave them no light. Cody's understanding of loyalty was fundamentally flawed. He believed it was owed to him unconditionally, a reward for simply being who he was. He never grasped that leadership, especially in a plural marriage, must be earned again and again through presence, empathy, and consistency. Instead, he acted as if loyalty from his wives should be automatic, regardless of whether he deserved it or not. He was the self-appointed king in a kingdom where the subjects were expected to be grateful just to serve. And while he spoke often of unity, his actions revealed division. He made decisions in private but expected public support. He allocated his time disproportionately, not based on need but preference. When the other wives expressed hurt, he dismissed it as drama. When they asked for equal treatment, he accused them of being ungrateful. The imbalance wasn't just emotional, it was logistical. Vacations, holidays, family meetings, they all started to orbit around Robyn. It was no longer a plural family. It was one marriage with a few attachments. But perhaps the most telling evidence of Cody's approach to family was how he responded to resistance. When Christine began to pull away, he didn't ask why. He demanded loyalty. When Janelle questioned his decisions, he didn't offer transparency. He doubled down on defensiveness. And when Meri sat in silence, he allowed the silence to stretch into years. He was never interested in understanding. He only wanted compliance. Cody claimed his role was divinely inspired, but what he practiced wasn't spiritual leadership. It was emotional coercion cloaked in biblical language. He spoke of sacrifice, but the sacrifices always came from others. He spoke of obedience, but never applied it to himself. He spoke of fairness, but fairness meant whatever benefited him at the time. And the saddest part? For years, the women tried. They really tried. Christine bent herself into knots trying to be the cheerful, accommodating wife. Janelle became the practical problem solver, always picking up the slack. Meri hung onto hope long after that hope had dried up. They weren't perfect, but they were present. And they believed, for a long time, that their presence alone might be enough to make things work. But presence without reciprocity becomes exhaustion. Hope without change becomes despair. And love, when one-sided, becomes survival. These women didn't give up easily. They were worn down, gradually, quietly, painfully, and the audience saw it, episode by episode, year by year. The sparkle in their eyes faded. The laughter became less frequent. The words of support turned into long pauses and tired smiles. What we saw wasn't just a family in conflict. It was a structure collapsing from within. And through it all, Cody maintained the same narrative, that he was doing his best. That if only everyone else would fall in line, it would all work. But families aren't hierarchies. They're not businesses. They can't be led by ultimatums and expectations of blind loyalty. They thrive on mutual respect, shared vulnerability, and the kind of leadership that listens before it dictates. So when viewers wonder what changed, the real question is, what took so long to be seen? The truth was never hidden. It was just ignored, dressed in matching outfits and smiling family portraits. But behind those smiles was a storm, building slowly, waiting to be acknowledged. And now that it has been, there's no going back. The illusion has cracked. And from those cracks, the truth has finally emerged, quietly, powerfully, and undeniably.
And for me, I'm one of those people who wants to be very fiscally responsible and very about, let's be responsible with our money.
But what happens when loyalty turns into clarity? When years of emotional sacrifice finally reach their limit and the heart says, enough? That's what happened with Christine. Once considered the emotional anchor of the Brown family, she didn't erupt into rage or walk away in scandal. Her exit wasn't a rebellion, it was a quiet revolution. After decades of investing her entire being into a system that never truly valued her, Christine didn't burn the bridge, she simply walked away from it. And that, in itself, was revolutionary. She didn't leave because she stopped caring. She left because she had finally cared enough about herself to stop staying. Christine had long been the smiling glue, the ever-optimistic presence who tried to keep the peace, who swallowed disappointment, who excused imbalance for the sake of spiritual harmony. But over time, the smiles became strained. The laughter turned hollow. And slowly, her light began to flicker under the weight of neglect. Cody's presence in her life had become more symbolic than supportive. He showed up for appearances, not for partnership. And Christine, for all her strength, began to see that love should not be begged for. That validation shouldn't require performance. Her decision to leave was rooted not in bitterness, but in renewal. She didn't want to destroy the family. She wanted to reclaim herself. She wanted her children to see a version of her that wasn't always tired, always compensating, always diminished. In leaving, she wasn't breaking a family apart. She was showing her children what it looks like to choose self-respect over sacrifice. And in doing so, she became the most courageous version of herself. Janelle, grounded and pragmatic, observed Christine's journey with eyes wide open. Janelle had always been the most independent wife, the one who preferred practicality over emotional entanglements. She wasn't loud or confrontational, but she was clear. And when Christine made her move, Janelle didn't rush in to defend Cody. She stood beside her sister wife with quiet solidarity, not because she had to choose sides, but because she recognized the truth in Christine's pain. It wasn't long before Janelle began to reevaluate her own position. Years of stability had masked a deeper yearning, one for fairness, for presence, for shared responsibility. Her relationship with Cody, once anchored by mutual respect, had turned into an exercise in detachment. He had stopped showing up, not just physically, but emotionally. And Janelle, like Christine, realized that the burden of holding a marriage together should not fall solely on her shoulders. Her support of Christine wasn't an act of rebellion, it was an affirmation of their shared experiences. Together, they began to see that they weren't crazy or dramatic or disloyal. They were simply tired of being unseen. Tired of having their voices dismissed and their feelings diminished. And in that recognition, they found strength, not just as individuals, but as women reclaiming agency in a story that long erased their perspectives. Meanwhile, Cody and Robyn built their own parallel reality, one in which they were misunderstood victims of circumstance. Cody claimed he had always tried his best. Robyn cried through her eyeliner, lamenting that she didn't ask for any of this. But their version of the story was too clean, too curated. Because if you truly listen, really listen, to the pain in Christine's voice, to the exhaustion in Janelle's eyes, you realize that their exits weren't impulsive. They were overdue. Kody and Robyn's attempt to rewrite history felt less like an honest defense and more like a desperate attempt to maintain control over a crumbling narrative. They painted themselves as the stable center while ignoring the chaos they helped create. Every tear from Robyn came wrapped in self-preservation. Every defensive monologue from Kody served as a distraction from the real issue, that his leadership had failed, that his favoritism wasn't imagined, that his absences weren't excused by duty, but exposed by choice. And the audience, we saw it. We felt it. We watched Christine slowly lose her light. We watched Janelle grow more distant. We noticed the way Kody's visits became less frequent and more performative. The show didn't need voiceovers or dramatic music to tell us what was happening. The truth was in the pauses, the looks, the subtle shifts. And by the time Christine packed her things, it didn't feel like betrayal. It felt like release. The most powerful moments didn't come from shouting matches or explosive arguments. They came in the silences, the moments where you could see a woman realize that she mattered, even if her husband didn't think so. The show, once meant to showcase the strength of plural marriage, began revealing its cost. And Christine's exit was the invoice. What made it even more poignant was that Christine didn't vilify Kody on her way out. She simply told the truth. She shared her disappointment, her fatigue, her hope for something better. And that honesty, delivered without theatrics, was more devastating than any accusation. Because it forced everyone, including viewers, to ask the hard question, if this is what devotion gets you, is it worth it? Christine's story became a mirror, not just for the other wives, but for anyone who has stayed too long in a place that no longer feeds them. And as she walked out the door, she wasn't running away from something broken. She was running toward something whole. Herself.
He knows the buttons to push. So with me, it was like, no, we're not going to be intimate anymore. Then he'd be like, well, you could do this and you could do this and you could do this and put it all on everybody else.
And then there was Meri. Always there, yet somehow never fully present. Always speaking in measured tones, but rarely saying what she truly meant. Out of all the sister wives, Meri's role was the most tragic, not because she endured more overt conflict, but because she endured in silence. Long after the love had faded, long after Kody had made his disinterest abundantly clear, Meri stayed. Not out of hope, necessarily, but out of something deeper and more complex, an identity intertwined with sacrifice, an inability to untangle faith from loyalty, and perhaps most heartbreakingly, the quiet belief that if she stayed long enough, she might matter again. Meri's silence wasn't the silence of peace, it was the silence of survival. It was the kind of silence that grows louder with every family gathering, every milestone missed, every conversation where your name is a footnote rather than a feature. In earlier seasons, Meri tried. She really did. She smiled, hosted, participated. But that participation became performance, and beneath the polite smiles was a woman slowly unraveling. Her emotional withdrawal wasn't sudden. It was a retreat made over years of watching herself become invisible. When the catfishing scandal surfaced, it was more than a headline. It was a cry. A moment where Meri, desperate for connection, reached out in the only way she felt she could. That incident wasn't about betrayal. It was about loneliness. About the crushing reality of being in a marriage where the door was closed long ago, but the window stayed open just wide enough to give the illusion of possibility. Kody's reaction to it wasn't one of compassion or concern. It was rejection, led in moral superiority. And from that point on, Meri wasn't just marginalized. She was exiled. Still, she stayed. While Christine walked away and Janelle recalibrated, Meri remained in the background, a ghost in her own story. She framed it as strength, loyalty to the family, to her faith. But loyalty that costs you your sense of self is not noble, it's imprisonment. And what's worse, she wasn't even praised for her endurance. Kody dismissed her. The other wives pitied her. And the audience watched, episode after episode, wondering how much more she could take. Meri often claimed neutrality, as if not picking sides was a virtue. But neutrality in a system of imbalance doesn't balance the scale, it reinforces it. By refusing to speak against what was happening, she became part of the silence that allowed the dysfunction to grow. And that's the hardest truth, that by staying quiet, Meri inadvertently became complicit. Not because she agreed with Kody's actions, but because she feared the consequences of standing alone. This wasn't just about a failing marriage. This was about a woman caught in a system that asked her to disappear a little more every year in order to maintain peace. A system that offered her the illusion of belonging as long as she asked for nothing in return. And the longer she stayed, the harder it became to justify why. Every moment of silence became a brick in a wall that separated her from her own liberation. She was present in family photos, but not in family decisions. She was featured in episodes, but rarely in the narrative. Her voice, once confident, became hesitant. Her body language said more than her words ever could. A woman forever bracing, forever trying not to break. And yet, there was a flicker in her, still. A quiet rebellion that showed up in the smallest ways, in the way she sometimes didn't attend family events, in the rare occasions she allowed herself to cry on camera, in the questions she asked without asking. Meri's tragedy is not that she was unloved by Kody, it's that she continued trying to earn back that love in a relationship that had already expired. Her loyalty became her prison, and as viewers, we wanted so badly for her to choose herself. To walk out, not with bitterness, but with the dignity of someone who finally understood her worth. But every time she stayed, it felt like watching someone clutch a key while refusing to unlock the door. And still, Meri remains. A woman with faith, with history, with depth. But also a woman who needs to stop waiting for Kody to look at her the way he once did. Because he won't. And she shouldn't need him to. Her story deserves more than a supporting role in someone else's drama. It deserves a new script, one where Meri doesn't just exist for the sake of family harmony, but lives for the sake of her own peace.
Kody and I are now officially done. I don't know, honestly, where she stands with him.
By the time the fourth wall cracked in the Sister Wives saga, something fundamental had shifted, not just within the family, but in the way we, the audience, viewed Kody Brown. What once might have passed for awkward leadership or quirky patriarchal behavior gradually revealed itself as something deeper, darker, and far more calculated. The man who had insisted for years that he was only trying to hold his family together had, in fact, been prioritizing his own ego, his own comfort, and his own version of events. And the cracks began to show. The image of Kody Brown sitting on the family couch, surrounded by wives who once believed in the dream, had long lost its shine. His posture stiffened, his tone sharpened, and the twinkle of idealism in his eye turned into the glare of defensiveness. He no longer spoke from a place of humility or reflection. Instead, his words became monologues filled with therapist-speak jargon and vague spiritual platitudes designed not to heal, but to deflect. Terms like safety, emotional integrity, and boundary violations began to flood his conversations, not as invitations to deeper understanding, but as shields to avoid vulnerability. Kody often declared that he didn't feel safe, but what he really meant was, "I don't want to be held accountable." The idea of confronting conflict made him recoil. And so he twisted language, reframed the narrative, and made himself the victim of a dynamic he had long dominated. The audacity of that inversion did not go unnoticed. It became clearer with each passing episode that Kody was not searching for resolution, he was running from responsibility. One moment that pulled back the curtain entirely was his boastful discussion of purchasing a two-seater convertible sports car. For a man with nearly 20 children and a family dynamic already hanging by a thread, the purchase wasn't just impractical, it was a billboard for a midlife crisis. It wasn't about transportation, it was about escapism. That car was not meant to carry children or groceries or family memories. It was meant to carry one man's ego away from the wreckage of his own creation. And in that gleaming, shallow reflection of metal and speed, we saw Kody for who he had become, a man who wanted freedom without responsibility. Meanwhile, his connection to his wives had turned transactional. The love had become conditional. The leadership he once touted had evolved into control masked as concern. And viewers watched as those dynamics unfolded, not with explosions, but with a slow, suffocating unraveling. Conversations became confrontations. Check-ins turned into interrogations. And every disagreement was followed by Kody's inability to simply say, "I hear you. I understand. I'll do better." Instead, he blamed. He deflected. He manipulated. And when that failed, he turned to spiritual bypassing, insisting that any questioning of his behavior was an affront to God, to unity, to the family structure. It was classic narcissism wrapped in religious language. And Robyn, she became both his audience and his echo chamber, where the other wives once challenged him, questioned him, pushed him to grow. Robyn enabled him. She validated his every excuse, mirrored his disillusionment, and joined him in constructing an alternate reality where they were the only two rational people left. Together, Kody and Robyn became a performance piece, one long act of emotional evasion. Their version of reality required the erasure of everyone else's truth. Christine became the ungrateful wife, Janelle, the instigator, Meri, the misunderstood holdout, and themselves, the victims, always the victims. But the footage doesn't lie. The camera caught the shifting glances, the forced smiles, the stilted dinners where tension hung heavier than the air. And the audience, many of whom had once bought into the dream of sister wives, could no longer suspend disbelief. What was once a portrait of plural harmony had turned into a cautionary tale about emotional neglect and spiritual manipulation. Kody didn't evolve. He regressed. He didn't learn. He blamed. And as he built a fortress around himself and Robyn, he burned every bridge behind him, convinced that the ashes was someone else's fault. The man who once said he loved hard had forgotten that love requires listening, humility, and effort. Instead, he loved loudly, dramatically, and conditionally. And the damage was irreversible. The tragedy of Kody Brown is not just what he did to the women who trusted him, but what he did to the man he could have become. There was a version of this story where Kody learned, grew, and truly led with heart. But instead, he chose the spotlight over the soul. And by the time the fourth wall cracked and we could all see behind the curtain, what was left wasn't a misunderstood man. It was a carefully crafted illusion finally losing its grip.
So you think he's running an interference to protect her?
I don't ever remember him being this mean. Never.
If there was ever a word to describe Kody and Meri's relationship in the later years of Sister Wives, it wouldn't be love, and it certainly wouldn't be partnership. It would be standoff. The emotional void between them wasn't just uncomfortable to watch. It was palpable, heavy, and at times even chilling. They weren't a couple in crisis. They were two individuals trapped in a long, drawn-out stalemate, each waiting for the other to blink, to break, to be the first to acknowledge that the connection had not only withered, it had vanished. Their eye contact wasn't warm or longing. It was a battle of endurance, a staring contest charged with resentment and unresolved grief. Recall that infamous couch scene, Meri and Kody sitting side by side, bodies angled away, eyes scanning everything but each other. There was no intimacy there, no curiosity, no desire to bridge the gap. And yet, despite this emotional chasm, they both clung to well-worn phrases like "let's not go there" or "why are we still discussing this?" It became a recurring pattern. Every time the conversation edged toward accountability or acknowledgement, Kody and Meri defaulted to evasion. But this isn't just a storytelling device, it's the premise of the entire show. Sister Wives is, after all, a televised examination of lives in motion. If you're not going to look back, if you refuse to examine the past, then why stay in the spotlight? And Meri, still defending Kody in small ways, still suggesting that perhaps he wasn't entirely selfish, remains a mystery. Not because her actions are unclear, but because her motivations seem at odds with her experience. She lived through the coldness, the rejection, the slow erasure. And yet, she still tried to paint Kody as someone who might just be misunderstood. For the audience, this was infuriating. We've watched long enough to know who Kody is. His favoritism, his absence, his emotional unavailability, it's not a theory, it's a pattern. Pretending it's still up for debate isn't noble, it's exhausting. Meri's neutrality became her mask. She didn't confront, didn't challenge. Instead, she sat beside Christine or Janelle, listening to their frustrations, nodding gently, rarely offering more than mild affirmations. But this isn't true neutrality, it's passive endurance. It's participation without ownership. And that may have worked in the early years when the dream of family unity still glimmered. But now it just deepens the emotional divide. Go back and watch the earlier seasons, and you'll start to notice the signs that were always there, subtle shifts, micro-expressions, moments where the tension leaked out through body language. One such moment, when Cody was asked whether he ever felt like he needed to gain control over the wives. His eyes lit up, not with hesitation, but with excitement. That wasn't a question he feared. It was one he had already answered in his actions. Because Cody never wanted equality. He wanted control disguised as balance, dominance dressed up as spiritual leadership. Even Cody's old friends, who knew him before the fame, have quietly rolled their eyes at his dramatics. Like that time the family planned a boating trip, everyone else pitched in, prepping and lifting, making sure things were ready. Cody, he opted out, claimed it wasn't his thing. But it wasn't about boating. It was about effort. And more often than not, Cody didn't want to show up unless the cameras were rolling or the applause was guaranteed. The real enigma isn't his behavior. It's how he ever convinced anyone it was admirable. The emotional void wasn't just between Cody and Meri. It echoed through the entire family dynamic. It showed up in skipped birthdays, missed moments, and children who learned to stop expecting their father to be present. For the older kids, Aspen, Logan, Leon, the void became familiar. They filled it with resilience, with each other, with strength they shouldn't have had to find so young. Because when a father checks out emotionally, the absence doesn't stay small. It grows. It becomes legacy. And in that silence, in that lack of presence, the wives slowly began to wake up. Christine was the first to step out, then Janelle followed. But Meri stayed. Not because she was fulfilled, but perhaps because she was still holding on to an identity she didn't know how to shed. Her emotional vacancy wasn't an act of strength, it was a trauma response. And that's the saddest part. Meri didn't choose peace. She settled for numbness. So, if you're watching Sister Wives now and wondering why it feels more like a ghost story than a family show, this is why. It's not just the absence of love, it's the haunting presence of what was never truly there. And Meri, for all her endurance, remains the silent narrator of that slow decay. Long before the family shattered in public view, the truth had always been quietly there, woven into glances, pauses, and unsaid words. It was embedded in the sighs after Cody left a room, in the looks exchanged between the wives when one of them shared a painful truth, and in the tense silences that followed any challenge to Cody's authority. The truth didn't burst through in a dramatic reveal. It seeped slowly through years of footage, building season by season like a rising tide of quiet resignation. And for those watching closely, the signs were unmistakable. Meri's subtle retreats, Christine's deflated tone, Janelle's measured neutrality. These weren't character quirks. They were survival strategies. You could see the wives shrink a little each time they were interrupted, talked over, or gaslit into believing that their pain wasn't valid. And what made it worse was how often they were expected to keep smiling through it. The show may have been marketed as a celebration of plural marriage, but the reality was that it documented the slow unraveling of emotional health in a family built on inequality. One of the most revealing moments came when Cody was asked if he ever wanted more control over his wives. Instead of recoiling at the thought, he seemed invigorated. His body language changed. His tone sharpened. He didn't dismiss the idea. He embraced it. It was confirmation of something many viewers had suspected all along. Cody didn't want partners. He wanted participants in his vision. People who would support his leadership without pushing back too hard. And the moment someone, usually Christine or Janelle, stepped outside of that expectation, he responded not with curiosity, but with contempt. The wives' responses varied. Christine fought back quietly at first, then more openly as her emotional exhaustion became impossible to ignore. Janelle maintained composure, rarely raising her voice, but her distance was its own form of rebellion. And Meri? She folded inward, trying to convince herself that acceptance would eventually bring peace. But what she got instead was erasure. Even in conversations that seemed neutral, like family meetings or holiday planning, you could sense the imbalance. Kody's voice dominated. Robyn's voice echoed his. The others defied. The hierarchy wasn't declared, but it was deeply felt. And over time, it hardened into something almost unbreakable, a family structure that required silence from most and spotlight for a few. But viewers noticed.